So in the first video, which is going to be this one, let's talk about the niche that has, I think, been produced by the combination of the much longer than normal power of the boomers and their particular way of behavior, vis-a-vis, in particular, their children, millennials. So a decent chunk, and remember, of course, reality is super complex and everything is always much more complicated than any given particular explanation could possibly account for. So this is just a piece, but it's an interesting piece. So let's see. One of the characteristics that I think is really important to understand what's going on right now is that millennials have developed as a group, more or less. Obviously, quite a lot of diversity among who millennials are, but more or less in a context that has two or three primary characteristics. One characteristic is a much higher than ordinary in human experience level of the presence of authority. Right? So this is the whole notion of being raised in a context where there's always some kind of authority, a parent around. No more playing by yourself out in the wilderness, always some kind of playground coach vibe, right? Being sherped back and forth in minivans to play dates and things like that. And by the way, more as time has worn on. So this is even more true for the youngest millennials and probably even more true for the oldest of Gen Z. No, certainly even more true for the oldest of Gen Z. So I'm going to call this an infantilization. All right, this is a separation of a relationship with reality, physical reality, like nature, and to a meaningful extent also a relationship with your peers outside of a context of having an adult authority in charge of the environment. And this, by the way, was pretty famously noticed for millennials in the context of, I think it was called helicopter parenting, where you had for the very first time parents who would show up in college context, in university context, and have direct conversations with college professors on behalf of their college-age children. And if that seems ordinary to you, I assure you, up until 10, 15 years ago, it was extraordinary. It would have been absurd for my parents to show up at my university and have a conversation on my behalf with a professor. They may have had a conversation with the professor to be interested in what was going on, but the notion that they would come in and kind of tell a professor to treat me differently it is just almost amusing. And yet I think that became at least somewhat common. And that's kind of the point, right? So the point here is that felt sense of infantilization, and I don't want to sort of denigrate the millennials as a consequence of using that term, because I think obviously by definition they were the recipient, and in many ways the unwilling recipient of that. So what happens in that context? And it's kind of like two distinct things happen simultaneously. One is a real felt sense and also a reality of disempowerment, a lack of agency, a lack of real agency, a lack of capacity to influence reality directly. Right? In this context, the way that you influence reality is indirectly. You influence reality by influencing authority. Okay? So you yourself don't actually have direct agency in the world. What you have is the ability to cause another agent, an authority, to behave in a certain way. So, if you're in nature, like you're in the forest and you have to make a fire by rubbing sticks together or whatever, you have direct agency. The only way to solve the problem is through your own personal capacity to do stuff with your body and your mind and in the relationship with something that does not care how you feel or what you say. But if there's an adult there and you try and it doesn't work, and the way to get the fire to start is you figure out how to convince the adult to do it for you, now agency is shifted. Right? The center of agency is in your capacity to be effective at the level of social interaction. And my proposition is that this omnipresent, or this is always the thing that's present in the human field, has over the past 20 years or so, in particularly in the developmental environment of millennials and Gen Z, really shifted in the direction of agency is socially mediated. And then the next thing that happens is you will adapt to that. Right? You will optimize for your niche. right? So what has happened is that um, pseudo-intentionally, like I don't think intentionally, but there's a lot of intention to it, the boomers have created a context which has infantilized the millennials, um, and have created a niche where optimization for manipulating boomer power structures has been the primary mode for successful agency of a huge cohort, right? The millennials. And obviously, I don't mean everyone. I don't even necessarily mean most, but the plurality at least, and as a sensibility. And so this explains a lot of what we're seeing now. What we're seeing is a real felt sense and a reality that agency is had through utilizing techniques to convince authorities to change their behavior. And by the way, these techniques are optimized to work on boomer authorities. Okay, well, why is that? Why is that last piece so important? Well, as Eric Weinstein and many others have noticed, the degree to which and the duration over power in social institutions maintained by boomers is actually rather singular in history. So the boomer generation has had more ubiquitous control over social institutions of all kinds, and over a longer period of time than we've ever seen before. So it's a bit like a monoculture for optimization. So we've got a situation where you have a infantilizing instinct, an instinct to provide a kind of control structure, to want to kind of be involved in controlling what's happening, probably for the benefit, intentionally at least. In helicopter parenting, I doubt it is intended to be child abuse, which has lasted a long time and been ubiquitous, which creates a certain tenor or flavor or typology, and therefore has been the niche for optimization. Right? So millennials, at least within this subset, like this in this lens, are optimized for manipulating boomer power structures in the social field. If you use this to try to make sense of what's going on right now, you'll see a lot of that. Right? You'll see a lot of what's happening through the lens of a body politic people, and I'm speaking mostly about the protesters, who have a distinct orientation that their agency really is in manipulating, convincing power structures. And the techniques that they use are optimized to manipulate and convince boomer power structures, which now are showing up as being effectively controlled. Right? So it works. The millennials have figured out how to manipulate and control boomer power structures. And so this is one of the reasons why, for example, this felt sense of like there are no adults in the room. There are no adults in the room, right? The kids are still kids. They're still not mature, fully capable of taking responsibility that frankly is beginning to be theirs to take, acting in a more adolescent fashion because they are in fact separated from agency and have been separated from agency for effectively their entire lives, in a situation, by the way, where they know things are fucked up and need to change. And their tool has been to modulate the behavior, to manipulate authorities. Now they're really good at it, and so the authorities are basically just being evaporated. It's kind of like the barbarians invading the Roman Empire. Like the boomers' capacity to actually guide effective choice is maybe nil. I don't even know, but it certainly looks like there's either no capacity or even negative. It makes things worse. And the millennials are rushing through the gap, but still in this mode of the way to behave is to figure out how to get authorities to accede to your demands. Okay, I think that's the whole thing.